doing vocal exercises.
I'm leaving that in. So welcome to a new episode of the Spotlight Podcast here from Lighthouse. And in this podcast episode, we're going to do kind of a tie-in with a feature that we've done recently. This was actually a live event that we did, I don't know how long ago, Blake, like 2 weeks ago?
I was actually thinking about it. It was either 1 week or 2 weeks, but holidays are really difficult to keep track of.
Yeah, it's the holidays, so everything is a blur. But this was a really fun live session that we did. And it's called How Much is a Playoff Win Worth to Hoteliers? Blake had this really, really cool idea where he wanted to quantify, we know that sports is a huge deal for revenue managers. Specifically, playoff games are an even bigger deal. So we wanted to put some numbers behind that and do some research and see how much is a playoff game really worth to hoteliers when you're lucky enough to get these kind of events. Do you want to do maybe like a really quick breakdown, Blake, of maybe even like conceptualizing the idea and then ultimately what you landed on? Because we tried to get a good mix in there, right? Like we did some NFL, MLB, some soccer too.
Totally. Yeah. I mean, I had conceptualized it a while back and I was just thinking through baseball specifically, but honestly, it applies to everything as we will get to. But baseball was what I was thinking about, but any series where it's best of 5, best of 7, and if you're a hotelier and your market is the host market for those games 6, 7, 5, you don't want to see a blowout. You don't want to see one team sweep. You want it to get back to your home stadium for those really consequential game 5, game 6, game 7s, rather than a blowout and you don't even get those games, because that's a lot of money you can really charge for fans that are willing to travel, for fan bases that are really passionate about their teams. And I mean, if you think about it, that's just incremental revenue. If you're popping your rate from $250 to $600 or whatever the number is, that's going straight to your bottom line mostly. I mean, that's money that you can pay bonuses with. You're getting your own bonuses based on that. I mean, that's a lot of really consequential dollars for an owner.
Yeah, for sure.
Operator.
Yeah. And I used to work at a property that was really, really close to the Cowboys Stadium here in Dallas. So we would every year, it was really big. And I know this isn't playoffs necessarily, but every April they would release the Cowboys schedule. And, we would go in and protect all that inventory. And so we were really, really obsessive with doing that. And with the playoffs, it's just ratcheted up even more, right? So we're really, really paying attention, especially if you're in a market where you're close to an NBA stadium or NFL stadium or whatever. You are, or you should be, keeping a really, really close eye on your team and how they're performing, because if they get into the playoffs, then all of a sudden you've got this really dynamic situation where, if it's NFL, they might lose a game and then they're out. Or if you keep making it deeper into the playoffs, you've got these crazier and crazier games that are getting, even bigger opponents. And, it's all really, really exciting, but there's a lot of different factors to it. As we were doing this, or Blake, as you were kind of pulling this data, you were looking at a lot of different factors, right? So the team's fan base, the distance to travel. So how far are people willing to travel to come see their team? Play in that venue? What is the star power? So what I'll do, just so I'm not listing all these off, and, obviously we've pivoted to video now with the podcast, but I'm going to put this up on the screen so you can see kind of what we've identified as the really, really big factors that should be considered when you're looking at the impact of these playoff games.
One thing that, we didn't really talk about on the live event that I want to touch on really quick is certain markets just have higher rate ceilings to them. And that has such a big impact. Just as an example, you have Super Bowl, I forget what year it was, but it was a couple of years ago. You had Super Bowl in Miami, and that was right around the same, I think the year before or year after was Minneapolis. So you have two markets that are both hosting the Super Bowl, but the price ceiling in a market like Miami is just inherently higher than the ceiling of a market like Minneapolis. Now, we're talking about the Super Bowl, so obviously time of year is going to be a consideration. You think about Minneapolis, up north, cold, February, really cold. So it's not generally a market where there's going to be a lot of demand necessarily in February. However, and then obviously February is high season. Florida, January, February. That's near their peak or at their peak. So, obviously we're talking about two disparate demand periods for their respective markets. However, broadly speaking, people, you have a market like Miami, there's clout, there's not that, anything wrong with Minneapolis, but you have people who are high rollers and there's like money to be spent, and it just has that panache or that cachet about Miami. There's high rollers coming to town and let's spend some money on a suite. And that's not to say there won't be high rollers spending money on a suite in Minneapolis, but just I think the willingness to ball out and flash your money is probably higher in a market like a Miami or a Los Angeles as opposed to a market like Minneapolis.
Yeah, for sure. And actually, I want to pull up, let's do a little side detour and let's talk about Super Bowls, because I think the host city for the Super Bowl is a really, really big deal from a revenue management perspective.
Huge.
A lot of, well, first of all, I'll start with my anecdote of my experience with the Super Bowl. So when we hosted the Super Bowl here in Dallas, it was Packers versus Steelers, which was like a nightmare matchup for Cowboys fans because, you've got those two teams playing on your home turf. Brutal. It was a little painful. Mm-hmm. And there were these really, really high expectations because the stadium at that time was only like 2 years old. But we also had this crazy freak ice storm that kind of swept in.
I remember that.
It didn't really, keep in mind the Steelers as a fan base, they travel really, really well. Same story with the Packers. They travel really, really well. And both of those fan bases were not really, like, ice was not really a big deal to them. So they kind of were able to laugh it off. But it definitely had a little bit of, I would say, like a negative impact because you actually knew days in advance that ice storm was going to happen. So it had kind of like this downward pressure on rates and demand. So I feel like that was a little bit of a missed opportunity. I think had the weather not been crappy, that probably would have been a way bigger deal. And then also, too, another Super Bowl that's coming to mind is whichever Super Bowl was hosted most recently in Los Angeles. That one, a lot of people told me, again, this is kind of anecdotal, but there was a really, really diffuse kind of, supply is so big in the LA market that ADRs were not as high as people thought. So you had a lot of hotels that last minute were dropping rate for the Super Bowl. Because that whole, think about LA, right? It's just this huge, sprawling metropolis. There's a million hotels in LA. So that kind of created this downward pressure on the pricing.
Totally.
Yeah. So I would think Miami, like you were saying, Miami is probably, from a revenue management perspective, I think that would be almost like a best case scenario because, like the F1 pricing for Miami is insane, right? We saw ADRs, $500, $600, $700. That's more...
Yeah.
That's a market that's really, really set up for crazy high rates.
Totally. And it's also one of these situations where it's like the percent growth for Minneapolis year over year for a Super Bowl is probably much higher for the Super Bowl for Minneapolis, is much lower for Miami because, again, you're in near peak season in February. But the intrinsic dollar value of your ADR in Miami is going to be so much higher, or, relatively speaking.
Cool. Yeah. So like I said, I'll put, and I'll flash it again now on the screen, but, all the factors that go into, pricing a playoff game. Like there's a ton that you have to think about if you're a revenue manager.
Oh, yeah.
So a couple other, fun ones that, hopefully we'll get a chance to touch on would be, star power. So that was a big one that we found in some of these playoff games, right? So, Travis Kelce and Taylor Swift. Mm-hmm. We're going to talk about them here in a little bit, as well as the time gap in between games actually turned out to be a pretty big factor. A lot of good stuff that we found. So here, I think we can just kind of hit like the most, let's just hit the high points and really kind of talk through from a revenue manager perspective what some of our strategies are. Let's dip into the NFL a little bit. So things to think about. Let's say you're listening to this or watching this podcast and you are a revenue manager in an NFL market, right? To me, that means, all right, you're within an hour driving of the stadium. Again, kind of arbitrary, but that's kind of what I would define as being, close enough to get that sort of that impact. Some other factors, One thing that we found was time of year was a really, really big deal for the NFL playoff games, because I think you mentioned this a little bit earlier with Minnesota, Blake, but think about these markets, right? When does the NFL when do NFL playoffs happen? It's typically December, January.
February, yeah.
Yeah, and then the Super Bowl is happening in February. And I'll put this up on the screen, but the first two games that we looked at when we did that live event was a Detroit game, and then we looked at two Baltimore Ravens.
Yeah.
But the effect is still kind of the same, though, right? Because both of those cities, they get really, really cold, especially Detroit. Yeah.
I mean, this is a case scenario for Detroit. Who else is going? I mean, people go to Detroit in January, but not many. So this is a great way to get people in town.
Yeah, and it actually kind of, I think, was a good thing for the purposes of this case study, because, in both Baltimore and Detroit, January was their lowest priced month in both of those markets.
Yeah.
So when we saw these really noticeable jumps in ADR, and again, I'll put it up on the screen here, but for the Detroit game, pricing jumped 17%.
Yep, in a month.
That was our big finding. And the nice thing about it happening in January is it's happening in a vacuum, right? We know that these pricing increases, they have to be happening because of this game. We looked for other events. There weren't any going on. It's dead of winter. So we got this really good signal to noise where we can really see that 17% jump for Detroit.
In a week, not a month. Sorry, I said in a month. I meant to say in a week. You can see it was 113 on January 14th, and a week later it was 132, and it coincided perfectly, because you can literally see it went from 113 to 130 the day after the Lions beat the Rams and the Packers beat the Cowboys. And that was, sorry, buddy, but you're with the Cowboys. But that was critical, because that meant that the matchup wasn't actually established, but because the matchup is with their opponent was established the next day. But because the Packers beat the Cowboys, that meant the Cowboys were the number 2 seed. And when the number 2 seed lost, then the Lions, who were the number 3 seed, now were guaranteed a home game. So at that point, it didn't even matter who they were facing, which it ended up being the Bucs. But it didn't even matter at that point, because they knew they were hosting a home game because of that Packers game.
Right. Yeah. And this is why, and I think during our live event, we kind of mentioned this towards the end, but I'll just bring it up now, is if you're a revenue manager, you may not be a sports fan, but you should definitely keep up with what's going on, because this is one of those scenarios where if you were lazy and you were like, whatever, the Cowboys are probably going to win, we're probably going to go play in Dallas. It was the effects of another game that led to these really big pricing jumps in Detroit, right? Most people did not expect the Cowboys to lose that game. So as soon as the Packers had that upset, that changed everything, right?
Totally.
If you're a good revenue manager, then you're keeping an eye on that. And then as soon as the Packers win and upset the Cowboys, then oh my gosh, this means that we're going to have a home playoff game. Totally. So that's what you're seeing here, right? Is that upset happens, and then people run to their computers and they update their pricing for this game, because this is basically a free playoff game for the Detroit market.
Yep, and I mean, and to your point, if you are a revenue manager who is not attuned to the fact that the Packers beat the Cowboys also, and you didn't jack your rate up, then people who knew that there was going to be a playoff game may have booked your hotel at a much cheaper price, and you missed out on revenue because you didn't realize that you need to now pop your rate up. So now you lost out on a whole bunch of money as a result of that.
Yep. So become a sports fan. That's take away there.
Read the sports section.
You're right. And then we looked at a couple of Baltimore games too. Now, Baltimore is a little bit different. You don't see that really, really big pronounced jump in pricing until the opponent is locked in, right? So there's a good takeaway there. Again, if you're a revenue manager and you're, watching this, listening to this, you don't want to scare off demand that might otherwise stay for these playoff weekends. One thing that I noticed when I was revenue managing a hotel that was near the Cowboys Stadium is those games can be really strong, but they're not necessarily always a guaranteed 2-night sellout, right? Those games are happening either Saturday or Sunday. And a lot of times, oh my gosh, there's an NFL game. Let's put a men's day 2 house restriction. A lot of times you can't justify, being that restrictive or pricing super, super high, because a lot of times the demand isn't there across the entire weekend. So until you know what team you're getting and you know a little bit more about the setup, a lot of times hoteliers, it's smart to not just completely crank your rate up, right? Because that's also kind of lazy revenue management, right? If I know I've got a playoff game coming and I just put my rate at $699, right? $699, but I don't look at a rate shop, it's probably more likely that you're going to scare people off rather than snag a bunch of people at $699. So I think this is actually an example of Baltimore hotels being somewhat smart here. They don't start pushing rate until that until the matchup is set, which was the Ravens and the Texans, right? Or was it Ravens and Browns?
No, Ravens, Texans.
Yeah, it was Ravens and Texans for this one. So as soon as they know the Texans are going to be that team, then they went up and pushed the rate, which I thought was, that's what you see in real life, right?
Let me ask you something, Daniel. So if you are a revenue manager and you're hosting a playoff game, and the playoff game is a Sunday game, Sunday 3 p.m., which I believe is a standard time for a lot of these games, is the more common night, if they're only doing a one-night stay, is the more common night the Saturday, Sunday, and leave after the game? Or is it fly in Sunday morning and then stay Sunday night and then leave Monday?
Yeah. What you'll see there is really strong one night pattern on Saturday. People do tend to fly out on Sunday after the game. Not everybody, but great question. Like kickoff too. Like we didn't even get a chance to talk about kickoff times in the live event, just because there's so many other things to look at. But even kickoff time is something you have to think about.
Sunday night game, you're probably not having as much Saturday demand.
Exactly. Yep. And really what I found was beneficial was the later the kickoff, the more likely that people are going to stick around that night. It's not rocket science. You probably know that, but that seems to be a little bit better setup. And actually I did way back in the day, I did some data analysis myself on this because I had a lot of questions around, what's the best kickoff time? What's the best day of week? And weirdly enough, it was actually Thursday games were really the best from both an occupancy and ADR perspective and length of stay perspective.
Weekend or for Thursday for weekend demand? They would just stay through the weekend?
Yeah, exactly. And I know small sample size, obviously, right? Because I was only looking at a couple dozen Thursday games because they're just not that common.
Yeah.
But I think it had to do with the midweek peak overlapping with the game, then going into the weekend. So you had a mixture of, you had strong corporate base on the Tuesday, Wednesday. That is immediately replaced by football people who then turn it into a 3 and 4 night stay over the weekend. So really Thursday games are really, really good. Monday games are also really, really good. And again, this is kind of stepping away from playoffs, but just in general, NFL games, Monday prime time is really, really good. That's kind of where you get the biggest ADR premiums.
Yeah.
But yeah, big takeaway there is if you're a revenue manager, like look at all the different factors. And you probably are if you're in an NFL market, because that's probably, that's probably like your bread and butter. But definitely. Yeah, look at day of week is huge. Look at kickoff time. That's huge. Try to anticipate those stay patterns of people. That will definitely add a little bit to the bottom line as well.
How do you factor a market? Like there's obviously differences in the demand generator volume in a market. So New York, LA versus like a Green Bay, Wisconsin, which is clear like the prototypical football and football. That's the thing, is football, right? So obviously, there's other things in Green Bay, Wisconsin, but broadly speaking, that's what they're known for. So, if you're Green Bay, how are you, is your pricing strategy different, knowing just how much you're truly reliant on those playoff games and just given the, I don't want to say dearth, but just less demand generators outside of those Packer games?
For the bigger markets like New York that you mentioned, and New York's a little bit funky because they play across the river in New Jersey. Yeah. But, let's maybe use like LA as an example or something. What I've found as a revenue manager is whenever you're in a market like that, it tends to be, it's a little bit more smoothed out, right? So you don't have to worry so much about, am I going to have occupancy that weekend, right? So there's a little bit less pressure, I would say, to price it perfectly because you've probably already got some demand that you can always fall back on, right? So if I'm in LA and I'm 20, 30 minutes from the stadium, even if there's a game, I'm probably still going to have a good weekend just based on the market that I'm in.
Yeah.
Just occupancy is always so strong there. With a market like Green Bay, some of the smaller markets, Buffalo, markets like that really live and die by the NFL games, it's just a lot more boom and bust. And it just creates a lot more pressure as a revenue manager to really execute and really get it right.
Mm-hmm.
And you'll know, right? Like you'll check your benchmarking report and you'll see either, okay, yeah, we crushed it, or, oh my gosh, we had a horrible weekend. But in the bigger markets, it's a little bit more muted. You can kind of, you've got that base occupancy to where you don't, if you miss or you make a mistake, it's just not going to show up as much. Let's shift gears before we talk about, because I do want to talk about some like the key takeaways from, what makes baseball playoffs different from NFL, different from Champions League. One last thing we can talk about with football, and this applies to anything, right? But we found this San Francisco 49ers game, and this was a really interesting one because and we kind of did it as like a red herring in the live event where we showed San Francisco proper pricing versus San Jose. And really the big story there was it's all about proximity to the stadium, right? San Francisco actually ended up coming down and their pricing was much lower by the time they got to the arrival date. But San Jose was the market that actually swooped up at the last second when the playoff game was locked in. So there is a limit to some of the positive effects that you're going to feel, even if you are in a really, really strong, well, I say strong, but if you're in a really, kind of key market like San Francisco, NFL is not really going to move the needle for you just because they're so far from that new Levi Stadium, right? Levi Stadium is 45 minutes bare minimum game day, 45 minutes north of the stadium. So it's actually another market entirely, San Jose, which that's its own city. It's its own market. It's got 1 million plus people in that city. So really it's a different city that's picking up that demand. So main takeaway here would be set a realistic expectation based on your distance to the stadium. Another quick anecdote just from my days revenue managing near the Dallas Cowboys Stadium is every year in April, the schedule would get announced, and the hotels that were closest to the stadium underperformed because they cranked up their rate too high. Expectations were too high. Mm-hmm. And then they actually pushed out a lot of that premium demand kind of into those secondary markets. So places that were more like a 10-minute, 15-minute, 20-minute drive. Uh-huh. Yeah, exactly. They just compressed. They took that best demand and they compressed it out. Basically think of it as like concentric circles on like a dartboard, right? They pushed it out to that next ring. So definitely something to think about. And with this NFL game, San Francisco is not even really on that map, right? Yeah, they're not even there. So definitely, that sweet spot. My hotel was in a really good spot. We were about a 15-minute drive from the Cowboys Stadium, and that gives people a lot of options, right? Like they can shuttle, they can Uber, they can drive and park if they want. So
lime green scooter, baby,
or ride a lime scooter the whole way. All right, so let's talk a little bit about some of the stuff that we found with MLB games. Big takeaway here is, with the MLB games, the first one that we looked at was the Phillies. It was the Phillies and Diamondbacks from year before last. So main takeaways here are just the difference of the structure, right? The structure is a lot different for the MLB playoffs. So things to think about from a revenue management perspective are you've got more games, but you've got to understand the dynamic of those games, right? Does your team have that home field advantage where you're getting the 3 home games back to back to back if it's a 7-game series? Are you getting the first 2 and then the last 2 if it's a game 7 setup?
Right. That's each individual game is much more consequential in a football sense. It's not a series. I would say that a game 7 is the equivalent to a football playoff game because the winner is the one that's advancing. But in many cases, like we have discussed, a game 7 only happens if a game 6 outcome is a certain way. Because once you get to game 6, it's going to be 3-2 at that point. So if it's 3-2, the two has to win to force a game 7, and then usually the game 7 is the next day. So it's hard to get people to fly out the next day. So it's a different construct. I imagine a lot of people are probably pre-booking and then canceling if they can't. I mean, this one that we have on the screen right now is interesting because this is a game 6 price evolution. You can see that pricing starts to build for that game 6 right when they advance to the National League Championship Series game. This is the game 6 of the NLCS. You can see on the far left, that's when pricing starts to build. But pricing actually starts to fall after game 2 because the Phillies took games 1 and 2. But what made, I think, this one interesting was that game 2, the Phillies won 10-0. Pricing started to fall for game 6 because there was probably a perception that there's probably not even going to be a game 6. Ironically, there was, and the Phillies lost the series. So go figure. But from a revenue manager standpoint, they're thinking to themselves, if there is no game 6, I'm dead in the water because my rate is sky high at this point. And now I'm isolating the base demand, going back to the Baltimore Ravens example we talked about earlier. So now we want to prevent a situation where we want to at least make sure we have that base demand, and then obviously baseball demand on top of that will be gravy. So you see that pricing falls until October 20th, because that was when the Diamondbacks won game 3 and the Diamondbacks won game 4. So now, once they won game 3 and game 4, now it's 2-2. So in a first to 4 wins series, you're now guaranteed a game 6. Now you see pricing come back up. So it's an interesting story here.
Yeah. And I think MLB games are, I'm not going to say harder to manage, but they're definitely a little bit more finicky because there's also these dynamics that are going on within the series, right? Even if you're a mega fan of your team, you kind of don't want to blow out either way if you're a hotelier because you want to keep that series close. That's really going to get more people to come out and travel and see the game. So, when fans start to see a blowout one way or the other, it really does kind of diminish demand. And yeah, and we even saw that with the World Series. So let's actually look at a World Series here. This was a really good example of the World Series Game 6 and the World Series Game 7, which didn't happen because it was a blowout.
The Yankees, these are my boys. Heartbreaking.
I think everybody, even me as like a neutral, I wanted a close World Series. Everybody else wanted a close World Series, including, the MLB itself, right? Yeah. They scheduled Game 6 and Game 7 to be a Friday and a Saturday night.
Friday, Saturday, Yankees, Dodgers. Doesn't get better than that.
It could have been like the greatest series of all time.
All time.
And they certainly set it up to be that. And just, the Dodgers just ran away with it. So that's what you see here. What I'm putting up on the screen right now is a look at that Game 6 and Game 7 pricing, and you can see where the optimism and then the pessimism kind of happens, right? There becomes a point where these games aren't going to be a reality anymore, and that's really when that pricing comes down. And then to wrap up, just to get a little bit of that Europe focus in here, we wanted to see other sports too, right? And the Champions League was kind of this natural candidate to look at because in a lot of ways, that's their Super Bowl over there in Europe. So, but I'm sure a lot of us do know how it works, right? It's this 2-game series where you have to win on aggregates, right? You have to score more points and more goals than your opponent over these 2 games, and away goals matter a little bit more, right? So what we found was close series have better pricing premiums. So again, if you're a hotelier, this is what you want. You don't want blowouts, you want close series.
Close game 1 specifically.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, you want very close game 1s, and just to sprinkle in some other factors that we found, you want obviously strong opponents, preferably like the really, really marquee matchups, right? You want Real Madrid, you want Man U, you want Man City, Bayern, Arsenal, teams like that. And in addition, what we found was gaps in between the games also was beneficial as well. So kind of a best case scenario would be a really, really close game 1 and then a couple weeks off before the next game. So it gives time for that tension to build and people to book flights and book hotel stays. And I'll put up on the screen here what some of these price increases were for these host cities. when it was a tie situation. And then I'll put up on the screen right now, and pause if you want to see the exact jumps in pricing. And now I'll put up on the screen the results of when you have blowouts. So blowouts, you still end up with a positive outcome a lot of the time, but it's just not ideal, right? Because if you're Liverpool and you just got crushed by Real Madrid 5-2, you now have to go to Madrid and you've got to win by 3 away goals versus Real Madrid and then win a shootout.
Yeah.
It's probably not going to happen, right? So you might get a couple of diehard Liverpool fans that are going to travel for that, but nothing like what probably would have happened if it was 1-1. Also, some interesting stuff around time of year kind of mattered a little bit, because a lot of these Champions League games are happening, I would say, like really, really late winter. But for some of these markets, it still can be a little cloudy, a little dreary. Exactly. Yeah. It's like San Sebastian. In early March, that's it's probably still going to be.
We said 30% chance of rain. Right, rains every third day. So, rolling the dice if I'm going to be sitting in a poncho?
Yeah, like, do I want to go see my team get blown out by PSG
in a poncho?
And in a poncho, yeah, and it's drizzling and it's cold.
Have you ever worn a poncho?
Not unironically. I think I've worn a poncho for a Halloween costume one.
I've worn a poncho unironically.
Really?
It's like a plastic bag over your body. They don't breathe. It's very unpleasant.
It looks very uncomfortable when I see people in the in the stands at a Buffalo game.
I think the only times I've ever unironically worn a poncho were typically when I was a kid, younger, and we were at like an amusement park we traveled to Disneyland or SeaWorld, and we flew there, and it's like, we're here. This is the day we're here. We can't just abandon the trip, so we got to wear the poncho. And you're just like, oh, brutal.
Yeah, not an ideal article of clothing. Cool. Yeah, but I mean, those were the big takeaways. I mean, was there anything else that you felt like we didn't bring up or didn't mention?
Did we talk about Tay-Tay, or did we gloss over Tay-Tay?
I think we may have mentioned Tay-Tay for a second, but let's go back to it. And here's another thing to think about too. If you're a revenue manager, like, look at the context around some of these playoff games, because I feel like sports now is, think of how much more of a spectacle it is outside of just what's going on the field, right? So the Chiefs are this dynasty team that are in the playoffs every year. As of the making of this podcast in December of 2024, Travis Kelce and Taylor Swift, as far as I know, are still dating.
Definitely still dating. Every time Travis Kelce catches a first down, like this past weekend or 2 weeks ago, is just, you see they immediately zoom on Taylor Swift celebrating the catch every time. Without fail.
Exactly. So yeah, you got to think about the star power, right? So, and that kind of ties in with the traveling team, the strength of the opponent, right? I mean, there's mega stars, right? So, you even saw that. This is kind of an aside, but I'm thinking to, MLS games in the U.S. For the first time ever, I saw some markets that saw a little bit of price and ADR lift if Messi was coming to town. First time ever that I've ever seen MLS. I mean, outside of like MLS championship and stuff like that, but just for like regular season MLS games. It happened here in Dallas whenever Messi's team came and played FC Dallas. We saw it was still really small. It was really, really small. So don't think it was like Super Bowl level ADR, but there was a little bit of a lift there for that star power factor. So yeah, that plays into it, right? Even if it's MLS and it's just not that huge over here in the States. But if Messi's here, then it's something you got to pay attention to.
Totally. Right. It's the star power of the players and obviously their girlfriends in the case of Travis Kelce.
Yep, exactly. Which that used to be more of I feel like that used to be more of a thing with like the Cowboys, right? Like remember when Tony Romo was dating?
Oh, right.
What's her name?
Simpson, right? Ashley Simpson.
Yeah, Jessica Simpson.
Was it Jessica? Okay.
Yeah. It's a little throwback there for older Cowboys fans. Oh, yeah. So this has been a brief rundown. Again, if you want to know more about, I thought the case study was awesome. I think the data in here is really, really cool. And if you're a revenue manager, there's a lot of takeaways that you probably already know a lot of this stuff instinctually, but it's good to go back and review it from time to time. So I'll put a link in the description where you can download this PDF. You can look at it. And again, if these aren't your markets, that's fine. But just take a look at it and kind of see what some of these pricing effects are. And next time you have, NFL game or MLB game come to town, maybe this will jog your memory a little bit. You'll think back to this podcast episode or back to the live event, and then just kind of make some adjustments and tweaks based on, some of these different factors that we've listed here. So be sure to catch future episodes here, either on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever you get your podcasts. But thank you, everybody, for listening. And thanks, Blake, for being my co-host today. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
All right. Well, thanks, everybody. We'll see you next time.
Thanks again, guys.